I'm sure you've heard of carbon offsetting before, whether as an individual or as a company level project, but did you know that it can sometimes be used for greenwashing? Hello everyone, it's Emma and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all sorts of things zero waste, focusing on free, easy, and fun ways to live low waste and practical ways to be an activist. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure to hit the subscribe button and join this community. If you prefer reading or you need to read, there is a blog post version for this video in the description. Now, carbon offsetting has really grown in popularity over the years as the environmental movement has boomed. There are many different kinds of projects, but the most popular one is tree planting. And this obviously isn't a bad thing. Trees are great carbon stores. They pull greenhouse gases from the air and store them in their roots. And of course, purify the air we breathe, which is a great perk. Not to mention they also keep temperatures down by providing shade. Trees are great and there's no denying that, and I'm never going to diss on trees. But unfortunately, carbon offsetting is far from perfect. It can be used as a greenwashing technique, as we will expand on more later, but people will do this by either planting invasive species, just planting trees willy-nilly, by just planting trees on palm oil farms and other sort of tree farms that will just be cut down in a few years. Or also just saying like, hey, we carbon offset without having to do anything else eco, so they don't focus on their packaging, they don't focus on reducing emissions and so forth, so it can get pretty tricky. I think carbon offsetting has its place. I think it can be done well, and I think there are a lot of benefits to planting trees and benefits to doing these other carbon offsetting programs. But we do need to know, as a consumer, does this make a brand eco-friendly? Is a brand just greenwashing because they carbon offset? And also, how does carbon offsetting even work? So we're going to talk about all of that and more. First, let's talk about the definition of carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting is an action intended to compensate for the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of industrial or other human activity, especially when quantified and traded as part of a commercial program. In short, it's a business. And anyone can carbon offset. This isn't just for big brands and companies. You and I can carbon offset our emissions as well. Do I think it's necessarily worth it on the individual level? It depends. Companies tend to use carbon offsetting to balance out the good and bad, and individuals use it to offset the emissions that we create. Hence the name. If done properly through trustworthy organizations that are actually using your money for good, this can be a good thing. But how does carbon offsetting work? First, an individual or a company must calculate their carbon footprint. If you want to hear my full thoughts on carbon footprints, you can check out this video up here. In short, carbon footprints are sort of a guilt tactic for companies to push onto consumers. Carbon footprints on an individual level don't necessarily mean much. And again, this really depends on the person, but really, carbon footprints were created for businesses. Once your carbon footprint is calculated, you are then charged a fee based on the level of CO2 and other greenhouse gases you have created. The fee is paid to a broker or an organization that will use that money in projects that reduce carbon emissions, the most popular, of course, being tree planting. I like this image from TechTarget, which emphasizes the importance of reducing emissions before trying to offset. I feel oftentimes companies just continue their wasteful practices, being like, oh, I'll just plant trees to compensate for what I've done, instead of being like, oh, how can we reduce our emissions? How can we reduce our water usage? How can we cut energy? How can we reduce our textile waste? There are so many ways companies can reduce waste, other than just carbon offsetting, which of course isn't even reducing waste, it's just kind of compensating. And of course, these efforts can be applied to the individual level as well. If you're like, oh my gosh, do I need to be carbon offsetting? Think about reducing your emissions first. Things like turning off the lights during the day, opening the windows and using natural lights, turning off the AC if it's not actually a hot or cold day, and just letting the breeze run through your house. There are so many ways to cut your energy usage, and if you're looking for some more free ways to reduce your waste, you can check out my full series Zero Waste on a Budget, where I have over 250 ways to live zero waste completely for free that will also reduce your personal carbon footprint. Oh, that playlist is up here. There are some important things to note though, some sort of rules companies have to follow when carbon offsetting. The money used must represent the removal or reduction of emissions that would have not otherwise occurred. This is monitored by organizations that inspect projects and calculations. In other words, you can't give money to a tree nursery to carbon offset, as they are already going to be planting those trees and cutting those trees down. It must be an individual project. Second, carbon credits cannot result in more emissions created elsewhere. What this means is if one forest is protected due to a carbon offset project, another forest cannot be deforested, just because it's not protected as a result of this carbon offsetting and protection. And third, I think this one's pretty self-explanatory, the credits can't be reversed. Credits are permanent, and I think what this means is that you simply cannot plant a tree just to cut it down shortly after. You must plant that tree and protect it so it can do its job removing carbon from the air. Other permanent efforts are underground carbon stores that ensure carbon cannot make its way back into the atmosphere. This was great news to me. Because I thought what a lot of these companies were doing is just planting trees in a palm oil farm, a palm oil nursery, and just cutting those trees down later. Just saying, oh, we planted trees without actually following through. But how strict are these rules? Are companies actually having to adhere to these standards? Speaking of palm oil, I did a video on sustainable palm oil maybe in 2021? Was it 2 years ago? I think it was 2 years ago. You can check it out up here. And in that video, I'll give you a quick summary. We talk about sustainable palm oil and how there are some rigorous standards that palm oil companies are supposed to uphold, but they don't always. Those standards they seem strict, but they're actually very loose and they don't actually have to be followed, which is why RSPO certified palm oil, you actually don't know if it's actually sustainable because you can cut corners. So I was wondering, can companies cut corners with carbon offsetting as well? Let's discuss. This is straight from offsetguide.org themselves, and they say that standards do not have registration and enforcement systems. So it's very gray and it's very nuanced. So what really happens is it comes down to what program you choose to do your offsetting with. Unfortunately, you do have to vet them individually to see if they actually are upholding these standards, because across the board, they don't have to. Which means that my good news was crushed. Companies certainly can just plant trees in a tree nursery and then just cut them down years later without those trees actually doing much effort in carbon offsetting. So I mentioned in the beginning there are a few ways that carbon offsetting can be done, so let's talk about those really quickly. Of course, we have tree planting, but what this actually is planting trees in areas that have been threatened by deforestation in the past or are still currently threatened by deforestation. It also isn't tree planting, but also protecting trees, so just using that money to conserve that land, to protect it from loggers and so forth. And of course, trees hold and absorb a lot of carbon. There are also agricultural efforts in carbon offsetting. This is done with techniques and technology to maximize resources and reduce food waste right off the bat. This one was kind of surprising to me, and that is carbon offsetting via aviation. And I'm like, how? Isn't aviation one of the most polluting industries? And yes, it is. But what these efforts are is to basically make aviation less polluting. Airline companies use artificial intelligence to optimize flight paths and invest in technology to reduce fuel usage. Next is renewable energy, which we love. If you would like to learn more about some renewable energy myths, you can check out this video up here. Things like wind, solar, hydro, and more aim to replace fossil fuels. There's also water management efforts, which takes clean water to areas that have to treat their water, and what this does is basically reduces the amount of energy and chemicals and processes that they have to use to treat the dirty water in that area, so it's just being pumped in clean instead. I'm not really sure the amount of energy that it would take, one versus the other, but it must be lower since it was on the list. Next is waste management, which I thought was pretty cool. It is designed to capture and utilize methane that is coming out of landfills, and I think turn it into energy. Because if you didn't know, sending food waste to the landfill creates tons of methane, which is very bad for the environment. So harnessing it and using it as a fuel source isn't great because methane is still like a greenhouse gas, but I think utilizing it instead of just releasing it into the atmosphere is good. Let me know your thoughts down below, and if you want to learn more about food waste and why methane is so bad, you can watch this video. Next is carbon sequestration, which can be done with plants, just for the record. Oh my gosh. I'll be right back. But these carbon sequestration projects are basically taking carbon out of the air and storing it in the ground without the use of plants. Sometimes it is used plants, but others are like actual man-made facilities, and also storing carbon in rocks and swamps, and also just straight into the soil. And they do this by choosing the areas that are the least likely to release that carbon back into the air. And then we also have energy efficiency, which I'm not really sure if this is carbon offsetting, but rather reducing the amount of carbon we create by just making our lights and our appliances more energy efficient. Now, the question you've all been waiting for, is carbon offsetting greenwashing? Yes and no. Unfortunately, as it often is, it depends on who's using it and why they're doing it. I talked about this with my TerraCycle video as well. If you want to learn more about TerraCycle, you can check that out up here. But the same thing happens with them. The program itself is not greenwashing, but companies can use it to greenwash. It's the same with carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting itself, not greenwashing. But when companies use it for bad, then it's greenwashing, which is why it's very gray. For example, this is just theoretical. If Coca-Cola decided, hey, we're gonna plant trees, we're eco-friendly now, and that's all they did, that's greenwashing. But let's say a company like Pila, now this one is actually a legitimate example, not hypothetical. They create phone cases out of plastic. They don't use any plastic, like oil-based plastic, in their shipping, and they carbon offset. That's just the icing on top of the cake, not greenwashing. Hopefully that makes sense and clears it up for you. And maybe you have a different thoughts. Like, do you think Pila is greenwashing because they carbon offset, or do you also think it's just little sprinkle of extra eco-ness on top. Do you think carbon offsetting is greenwashing all the time? I would love to hear your thoughts below. As with all your eco shopping habits, you have to look at the brand as a whole. And we're going to be talking more in depth on how to spot greenwashing in 2 weeks. But for now, you can download my free guide to spotting greenwashing down below. It's always in the description. But always be sure to look at the whole company. As I said with the Coca-Cola hypothetical scenario, if that's the only thing a company is doing and they're still creating tons of waste, it's greenwashing. You want to look and see, like, what's their packaging like? Is their product actually eco-friendly? Do they use energy efficient factories? Do they use green energy? There's so many different questions you can ask yourself. Basically, just take a look at their about page. Any truly eco company should have like an eco certifications or like how we're being eco-friendly page on their website. If not, they probably have something to hide, or they're probably not actually eco. But basically what I'm saying is take some time to evaluate the company instead of just instantly praising them because they plant trees. Planting trees is great, don't get me wrong, but planting trees alone does not equal being eco-friendly. Let's wrap up this video by talking about, does carbon offsetting even work? Is it even worth it? Carbon offsetting will not fix climate change, but then again, no single solution is going to fix climate change. Recycling isn't going to fix climate change on its own. Reducing food waste isn't going to fix climate change on its own. Same with carbon offsetting. It's a great initiative for climate change, but it's not going to fix anything on its own. So we need all the solutions we can get. I think we should keep carbon offsetting. I don't think companies should keep using it for greenwashing. I think the standards should be higher, but for now we gotta work with what we got. But ultimately, it's never a bad thing to plant trees, and it's never a bad thing to reduce our emissions and sequester carbon. The downside to carbon offsetting, though, is of course emissions still happen. As I've mentioned with these wasteful companies, they'll just keep emitting and emitting and emitting and just plant some trees, all fixed, band-aid solution. So that is unfortunate with this whole thing. And this is especially unfortunate because these big companies with a lot of money can afford to do this. And they can afford to do it easily. I still think carbon offsetting is valuable, but we need to be careful. It will not solve all of our climate problems on its own, and again, as a standalone, it does not make a company eco-friendly. Look for other certifications like B Corp, Rainforest Alliance certified, certified carbon neutral, using recycled materials, companies that use green energy, and so much more. If a company's only claim to fame is carbon offsetting or tree planting, it's a red flag. They need to do more, especially if they have money and all they're using their money for is planting trees. They can do more. What about my thoughts on individual carbon offsetting? I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's necessary, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Unless you're a wasteful individual. For example, Taylor Swift, Kim Kardashian, other celebrities who are taking their private jet across LA and using their private jet every day and emitting millions, maybe not millions, thousands of tons of CO2 every day, every year. They could probably carbon offset, but for me, who takes like 2 flights a year, I don't eat meat, I drive a fuel efficient car, I drive a lot because of where I work, and like you as well. You as an individual, unless you're super, super wasteful, I don't think you need to carbon offset. And again, I think something more important we can do is just reduce. If you can reduce your light usage, your water usage, how much you're using your car, I think that's so much better, easier, and will save you money instead of using your money to plant trees. If you want to, great, but I don't think you have to. Now, something you can do that's totally free, and these are free ways that I guess you can carbon offset, is use a few apps. One of them is called Ecosia, I don't really know how it's pronounced. It's a web browser that you can put on your laptop or your desktop, and an app you can download to your phone and tablet. Every search you make in a search engine, not every search, it's this number of searches will plant a tree, which is one way that you can carbon offset totally for free. Another way is to use an app called Tree Card. Both of these will be down below. Tree Card uses your steps to plant trees. You can also get their wooden debit card and your purchases will plant trees. This is not sponsored by either of these apps. I just really love them both. I think those are great ways that you can plant trees totally for free. Now, if you do choose to carbon offsetting, be sure to vet the brand that you're using. Make sure that they're actually using your money for conservation efforts, that they're not just planting trees that are invasive or planting trees in a palm oil farm. If you want more information on how to find a quality carbon offsetting company, let me know and maybe I can make a follow-up to this video because I'm not really sure how to do that vetting myself, to be honest. It's just not something that I have really considered to do personally. And again, if you have differing opinions, like you think every single person should be carbon offsetting, let me know your thoughts again down below because I'm curious to hear all sides of this spectrum. Thank you so much for listening and watching along. I really appreciate it, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I hope that you found something valuable in this video. And if you did, I would appreciate not only a thumbs up, but also sharing this video with others to spread the word. And again, definitely stay tuned for my video on how to spot greenwashing, especially as Earth Month is just around the corner, and Earth Month is the time where companies will greenwash the heck out of everything and everyone. But for now, for the time being, be sure to check out my free greenwashing guide down below. And I also have a full video on greenwashing. If I haven't put it up here already, it's up here now. I will see you in next week's video in which I show you my zero waste bathroom. And until then, remember that your small actions have a big impact in the long run. Bye guys. Not to mention, they also keep temperatures down by, in short, carbon offsetting carbon footprints calculate how much money you need to use. You are then charged a fee based on the level of CO2 and other greenhouse I can't even read. You are then charged a fee based on the level of CO2 and other greenhouse gas. And they do this, they pick places that are very unlikely to actually release that methane and that carbon. And they do this by choosing specific places that are the least likely